think that in many ways the idea of a code, and I don't know what number you arbitrarily use here, but where I worked was code 99. The idea of a code is a very interesting concept. That a person is actually given a choice upon admission into a hospital whether he wants to have a code status or to have a non-code status. And I think a lot of that stems, the dynamic and the decision will often stem from an unpreparedness for death. And in many ways I think that this culture is grossly underprepared for that final act that all of us will taste. The Quran literally says that every soul is tasting death, so that we are by our nature really death tasters. And this is unfortunately kind of, some people are still eating, so I hope I don't ruin your appetites. But, and that's another interesting point, is the way that we look at death, that it's an unpleasant topic that a lot of us don't like to speak about death. But I think there are very specific reasons, and I don't want to dwell on them for too long, of why this culture has become a death-denying culture. I don't think that that was always the case, but I also say that with an awareness that the fear of death is a universal fear. And certainly we have traces in all our historical traditions of this fear of death. In reality, it's actually a necessity to have some fear of death. If we did not have any fear of death, we would be literally in a very precarious situation. We would not look both ways when we walked across the street, and that would eventuate in our own deaths quite quickly. So the idea of a fear of death is actually a necessity, but also the idea of overcoming that fear in a positive way is a necessity in order for one to prepare for death. If we look at the condition, the present condition of human societies, it's been termed the postmodern period that we're in by philosophers, and the idea there is that there is no longer a grand narrative, there is no longer a meta-narrative by which we can live our lives. That prior to this period of time, people believed in some cosmological explanation of the universe. They had a cosmology which they could live believing in. And like Nietzsche, the German philosopher, said, if people have a why, they can endure any type of how. In other words, that when people have a purpose for existence, the pain and suffering that goes along with human existence is bearable. But when they lose that purpose of existence, that pain and suffering becomes unbearable. And in many ways, I think that this is an essential point to understand when we look at the extraordinary consumption of tranquilizers in our culture, of alcohol, of ways of literally subduing and suppressing the pain and suffering that people experience with daily existence. And ultimately, coming to terms with death is part of overcoming this pathological obsession with the pain and suffering that goes along with human existence. So in this postmodern world, what has happened is the scientific worldview, in a sense, has failed us. And this is being articulated by, and has been for some time, by philosophers on the continent, in the United States, and we really see it in many ways in the great failures of the rational period, the period of enlightenment, the promise of a human society in which rationalism, in which technology would solve our problems and would give us a reason and a purpose for continuing working towards this great utopian society that would come into existence at some future date. And this century alone has been called the century of mega-death. Over 180 million people have died at the hands of technological destruction in warfare in this century alone, which is a much greater number than all of the peoples that have died in previous wars prior to this century. And so literally, like Desjardins, the Christian philosopher, said that the fundamental question that all of us must answer in order to continue as a species is literally a choice between suicide or between adoration. And what he meant by that is either we give up the adoration which is inherent in the human nature to adore, or we literally commit suicide, either by technological means or by other means. One of the Archibald MacLeish said that a world ends when its metaphor has died. An age becomes an age, all else beside, when sensuous poets in their pride invent emblems for the soul's consent that speak the meanings men will never know, but man imagined images can show. It perishes when those images, though seen, no longer mean. And what he's saying here basically is that people have a purpose. He uses the idea of a poet, giving meaning to a culture in metaphors. And I would say that we can extend that also to the religious phenomenon that has existed in the human species since recorded history, certainly, and by all intents and purposes prior to that. That people have sensed a meaning of life. And when those meanings literally disappear, when the metaphors are no longer applicable, then we enter into a crisis. And the crisis of our age has been termed nihilism, or nihilism, which is the idea that we are in a meaningless universe. George Bernard Shaw in 1921 wrote that the Darwinian process may be described as a chapter of accidents. There is a hideous fatalism about it. If it be a truth of science, in other words, if the idea that everything exists because of chance, without purpose, if this is a scientific fact, then the stars of heaven, the showers of dew, and winter and summer, the fire and heat, the mountains and hills, may no longer be called to exalt the Lord with us by praise. Their work is to modify all things by blindly starving and murdering everything that is not lucky enough to survive the universal struggle for hogwash. And again, what he is really saying there is that if it is meaningless, then ultimately this is survival of the fittest, that whoever wins, and ultimately what they win is meaningless also. The religious vision is extremely an incredible departure from this idea. And I know that many of the people here are scientists, are men of science, women of science, people that have studied the scientific worldview. And I don't know how many in the room are content with the scientific worldview as an ultimate answer. Because I think part of the problem with modern science is that it deals with the hows of existence, but it never deals with the whys. It tells us how things happen. It tells us how things come about, either through wonderful theories or through empirical observation of facts collated by scientists that are then placed into worldviews, scientific paradigms. And the paradigms will hold as long as the theory is not supplanted by another theory that better explains the facts. So all of us, as people that have either studied extensively or in a limited sense science, all of us, particularly in the West, have in some way placed an absoluteness in science, in modern science. In the same way that people prior to this civilization placed an absoluteness in theology, in the religious worldview. Now, for many people, the scientific worldview is, because of its obsession with how, and its really lack of emphasis of why, is really not a fulfilling worldview. It does not give us a sustenance whereby we can live our lives with a sense of meaning and purpose. Now, there are different ways of dealing with that fact, this emptiness or this vacuum that exists. I think one of the most common ways is literally choosing to die before our bodily death. And that is what's been termed a psychological death. I'd like to go to the first. In looking at dying and the idea of dying, we can see basically that there are